Yeah, it says that's working on your live stream, 30%.
Oh,
60?
nice.
It must be all of the crap that I have. All right, I think we're live.
Okay, yes, we're live.
Oh, yes, that's good. Okay. Excellent. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first stream that we've done in, I've heard it was been 5 frickin' months. So, yeah, I mean, we are late as usual, but largely we're just figuring out how all this stuff works. So, this is largely frontier streaming as far as we're
Yeah.
concerned.
We're doing a format change, and this was motivated by two different factors, at least on my end. First of all, I started out this year, kind of slow on, uploading content compared to the years previously. That's just sort of because the subject matter of my essays have become a bit more, they've become a bit more in depth and nuanced as a result. It sort of, it takes a lot more introspection and actually thinking to write about that stuff. So, I can't just print the videos out like the money printer. But at the same time, for those of you who don't know, I've begun living entirely counter economically. So I've been kind of moving around a lot lately, and as a result, I've had sort of inconsistent access to recording setup and the ability to actually write content. So, you know, that's been the case since July. That's the reason why it's taking so long to finish up the Hoffa essay.
Yeah, the last part's basically done. We just need recordings. I know that they're going to be thinking like, oh, this thing is never going to be finished, but yeah, it basically
Yeah,
is.
there's supposed to be 6 parts, and we haven't recorded the sixth part. The sixth part is just sort of it's just sort of a conclusion, and that's always the way that it was intended to be as well. Like we were just waiting for a bit, for responses to it,
Hmm.
and we're just sort of lightly touching upon. You'll see it when it's done, in other words. But yeah, so we started this new stream under a format change compared to Cool Capitalist Kids, which was the name the name of our old stream. The name is pretty edgy, but
Yeah, the main purpose of this is to be a bit more professional and to basically allow it to work and give us a bit more control over the
oh,
content. More specifically, we've had to do some finagling in order just to be able to get you guys to be able to hear it. I mean, I think the way it worked before is that Esso would just play the audio over his mic, and you would basically hear it from his end instead of being able to hear the audio directly through the stream, whereas now it works. And more importantly, instead of super chats, which I would recommend you please do not send a super chat, check the description of the stream. It will link you to a tip page where you can get your message sent to us directly on stream and we'll respond to it. And there's even text to speech enabled. So I wouldn't recommend you do it. But if you want to say the name of the country of Nigeria, you can definitely do that. However, I would recommend you don't do the gamer word because again, this is YouTube and they're very, very touchy about that kind of thing.
Heretic, this is a serious stream. Why are you letting people do text to speech? You know what's gonna happen.
What could they? What's the worst that could possibly happen? What are they gonna do?
Um,
Say what are they gonna do? Say Nicaragua?
Nigeria. But
Yes.
no, the other reason for the format change, aside from giving us the ability to respond to videos we otherwise wouldn't have the time to, just sort of an off the cuff format, is also so that we could have a bit more audience interaction, which that seems to be a better, more entertaining way to produce content anyway, and sort of
Hmm.
something I've been more interested in doing. I mean, I talk a lot on Discord, and it sometimes takes me away from my work, and that's also caused a bit of a production lag. But I think this would serve as a solution for that as well. But you know, do you have any specific motivations for wanting to, get on board with the format change, Heretic, or do you agree with everything I
I'm
just said?
I'm I'm kind of agreeing with everything. Also, let me just do something real quick. Yeah, there it
This
goes.
is a test donation for $48. Oh,
I don't know what you just did. I'm not watching the stream.
I just did a test donation just to see what happens. Chad, can you confirm if you saw that or not? I don't know if I'm pretty sure there's a slight delay on this, so I don't know how long until they notice. But hello? Crap, that's not good.
That's not good.
Oh, I thought everything went quiet, and I was just concerned that. Yep, Omen Rose saw it. So yeah, if we're in the middle of something and you want to completely interrupt us and force us to respond to whatever it is you're doing, go ahead and send us a donation through the link in the description, and yeah, it'll show up, and you'll get to see the cute fox gif. Also, I believe that there's something you wanted to share on Twitter regarding a tranny. Hold on a second, I have a thing prepared for
Oh yeah.
this.
Before we actually got into the video, somebody posted this a few hours ago in the back alley, and I thought this was the funniest thing I'd seen today, so we had to talk about it on stream.
Yep, there it
Is
is.
it on screen right
Yes, it
now?
is. It is on screen. Look at this abomination. Look at
Oh,
Look at that creature.
don't
So,
say that.
all right. So, from I haven't looked into it that much, so I'll let you explain what's going on.
So apparently there was. I have no idea if this person was like a prominent like red tube or on that side of Twitter, but they're a Twitter personality, and they went on a rant complaining about them being misgendered by somebody in public. Which, I mean, look at that person. It's not hard to see why a little kid or somebody would have a hard time knowing what to address them as. But anyway, so because of that, they decided that they were going to build a bomb and insinuate that they're going to use it to kill a bunch of people. And I just we had to talk about this because it paints such an absurd picture in my head. It's just such an absurd thing to do. I just the image that comes into my head is ma'am, like the person from GameStop who says it's ma'am,
It's
uh,
ma'am.
walking into the fucking store with like a bomb belt saying, I told you to address me by my proper pronouns, and then like explodes it up like Michael Moore in Team America.
This is just this is just unfortunate, and I'm not even sure if that could be categorized as a man or a woman. I think this is honestly the best argument I have ever heard in terms of gender being a spectrum, because quite frankly, I'm not even sure that that's human.
Yeah, I mean, it would be even more confusing if they had they them pronouns because that's not biologically a real thing. How am I supposed to tell whether or not that's what you want people to address you as? I can't get so upset about that. But this is just it's peak clown world, and that's fitting because this person rather resembles a clown.
I'm pretty sure they're not even wearing makeup either. They're just like, you can just be a clown now.
Use fucking crayons to put those those eyebrows on.
That looks like a magic marker, actually.
A damn crayon.
That is
It's not tattooed. It's yeah. It's one of those like makeup color pencils. I think.
Yeah, it's just terrifying. Anyways, I think we should get on with the video. I'm just gonna remove that thing now. And the chat
Yeah,
was
so
the chat was saying earlier that they couldn't see it. That was my fault. I had to press a button to get it to show up. So yeah,
okay.
you're good. So anyways, yeah,
And I
let's.
mean,
Sorry, you gonna
if
say something?
somebody is gonna if somebody is gonna complain about us, being mean to this person, keep in mind that they threatened to bomb people because somebody called them something that they didn't approve of being called. So I mean, I don't know if in that situation that person's really deserving of respect. So I just don't care.
Well, I think that's the right response to make. So, anyways, I think we should get on with the video.
Stuff like that paints a really it illustrates a pretty good argument against the idea of just collectively respecting everybody who has they, them, whatever pronouns
Respect is earned. It's not. Don't have an entitlement to it.
earned individually.
Hmm.
But anyway, yeah, we can get on to this video. Uploaded by Current Affairs, which you may know as the magazine that's ordered by Boomer Karens in the mail, or the magazine that hospitals and doctors' offices buy in order to make it look like it's a successful magazine that nobody actually reads in their lobbies. But apparently, Current Affairs is hiring. I don't know what this guy is, considering he's using Marxist talking points. Though I'll go ahead and make the safe assumption that he's probably a Marxist. But they're hiring Marxists to make videos for them on social media, and as a result, they've begun putting out steamers like this one.
Yeah, I mean, I watched it early. I read the article that this is based on all the way through, and I only watched 1 minute into it. I'll discuss the article as it becomes relevant in the video. But one thing I can tell you about this guy is that he is insufferably smug. And you'll see what I mean pretty quickly. So,
It's a pretty, that's like my least favorite kind of bread tube personality, because the less they know what they're talking about, the more smug they are. It's classic Dunning-Kruger effect. But something that I've noticed, and I'm working on a video that you'll all know what I'm talking about when it's up. But I was going to make essentially the same argument in that video. But I've noticed that a lot of the prominent RedTube personalities, for lack of a better way of putting it, people like ContraPoints, Thoughts, Lime, Non-Compete, they all seem to have this general attitude in their communities, and some of them have very explicitly made this argument in videos of theirs that you shouldn't debate people who actually hold the views that they're attempting to represent in their content or rant about on social media. And there's a community in those circles that strongly discourage associating with them or actually having discussions with them. And I think whether or not this is intentional, that's led to sort of, I refer to it as philosophical inbreeding, but basically people don't know what the hell they're talking about, and people are inspired by those arguments that are not informed by a proper representation of positions they're attempting to counter, and they go on to inspire more people who, it further degenerates until these people are just living in a completely disassociated reality. Like there's one guy, Vicky 1999, I saw, that would be a good example of this.
hold on 1 second. Invisible Hand, I see you're trying to get someone onto the Discord server. Go ahead and ping me on Discord, and I'll send you a link.
Okay, but yeah, so there's one guy in that community, Vicky 1999, I've seen. He put out a video. It was essentially attempting to respond to Austrian arguments about the market, or at least they, set up a little cartoon, and the person representing the position that they disagree with had an ANCAP sticker on him. So very strongly implying that that was the Austrian position, and used to represent the Austrian position. Vicky ascribed the Keynesian money multiplier argument to him. So that's the sort of thing that you get when you don't actually debate other people or look at what they argue or try to discuss things with them. You get ANCAP Keynesianism.
Pretty much, and you also end up with fundamentally an inability to understand what the other position is, which usually why one of the biggest and most common criticisms, not only that I have of the typical bread tube Marxist nonsense in regards to their criticism of other people, but also ones that I used to make myself is, no, that's not what people actually believe. No, that's a straw man. No this, no that. And it's even goes so far back as to you can see this in Karl Marx with not only Das Kapital to a lesser extent, but also, what's it called, the Communist Manifesto and several of his other essays, where he's trying to argue against a position that I don't think anyone actually holds. So it's...
And that's because the fundamental Marxist assumption about history, which is what Marxism is, it's an attempt to analyze history from a materialist perspective. The problem with it is fundamentally that it is a materialist perspective. It fundamentally is reliant upon the arbitrary interpretations that one person, attempts to ascribe all these random bits of data and random things that they're discussing into. They're trying to ascribe a narrative to these things, but they don't have to justify the narrative that they're putting them into, because they assume that the data or the material reality of these things just have some sort of inherent, like they just inherently explain things. So, I mean, these worldviews, tend to be very, it's very platonic, and as a result, it tends to be very disassociated from reality, but also it tends to be very tone deaf.
Mm-hmm.
They build all these weird arbitrary constructs that can't justify themselves, and there's no way within that framework to criticize it or to meaningfully expand upon it or understand it. It's just sort of an opinion at that point. And screen went black for a second there.
Don't worry, you're good. And someone is asking why we don't make the Discord link. We don't have a public Discord link. It's because, well, we've been raided in the past, and there are generally a lot of toxic people that we don't want to, be harassing people in our community. So that's kind of a thing.
I've put out Discord links in the past. I don't have any particular issue with doing that. I mean, if someone's going to come in and be toxic, we can just ban them on site.
That's true. But we should get on with the video because we're like 20 minutes in. We haven't gotten started yet.
All right. That's fine, I guess. Long story short, the person making this video is a primary example of the kind of person that I was describing.
The alternative, of course, are the people like, oh, what's the name of the guy that creepy guy who runs like that Marxist kids show. And then again, I'm saying Marxist kids show, and there's like dozens of them on YouTube.
Yeah, Non-Compete is the one I think you're thinking of.
Well, there's Non-Compete. There's the one where they take a real person in, and then they make an animated version of them, and they have them sing a song. Some really stupid song. The Birds and the BS. That's what I was thinking of.
I have not seen a video from that guy in a long time. I don't know if he even still makes content. Also, I don't think I'd describe him as a Marxist. It's just some basic bitch Democrat Party shill.
I mean, at this point, it's getting hard to tell a difference. But anyways, let's actually get started.
Yeah, fair enough.
What do you think of when you hear the word?
I can hear it from your mic.
All right, I muted.
All right.
Collective.
Wait, let me just start over from the beginning.
What do you think of when you hear the word collectivist? Bees? Ants?
I think of authoritarians trying to create a false dichotomy.
I think I always think of authoritarians as well. It's not. I mean, bees and ants never even crossed my mind. When I first watched this video, the minute through, the first thing I thought of was the Soviet Union.
So, for those who are not aware of the actual individualist criticism, quote unquote, of what is commonly referred to as collectivism, this is actually a mischaracterization of the entire debate. The actual debate, and this is I'm mentioning this because it's going to be important, as you'll see. The entire video is essentially based on making a mischaracterization of the two arguments. But collectivism, in its proper philosophical title, is referring to something known as philosophical structuralism. And philosophical structuralism is the notion that inherent in just, I guess, the universe, there are social structures or things that create social structures that people conform to. And therefore, the way to understand social organization is to understand, the intersection between these various different structures in nature and how they affect human existence. And the methodological individualist position, which is typically what we're talking about when this debate is being brought up, is the notion that no such structures actually innately exist because people need to exist in order for societies to form. And as a result, because humans are moral agents who inherently pursue a sort of what their own perceived interests are, social structures are actually built and influenced by these innate interests. And therefore, we should understand how the psychology of people to understand the structure of society. That's the actual debate. Although something very disingenuous you'll see with how the so-called collectivists tend to argue this position is that they'll use equivocation. They call it collectivism, and they'll say, well, that's just whenever you associate with a group, and individualism is when you want to be Ted Kaczynski.
It's oftentimes you'll see the term collectivism and individualism, mostly individualism, to be construed as a false binary. People, and I saw this a lot with the Hoppian critique of our part 4 on covenant communities, where they attempted to argue that, oh, you're just atomists. And I think I actually made that one the part 2 as well, where they argued that our position was atomism and we didn't want anyone to associate ever, as though the dichotomy were between top-down structuralist hierarchies and nobody associating with anyone ever at any point. Which, I mean, it shows how far, not only how far that they're willing to go to be disingenuous, but also showcases their lack of understanding of the topics and the lack of their depth and breadth. But anyways, yeah, I'm going to keep going now.
And I just wanted to add very quickly that the reason why I would characterize sort of what I explained as the real version of the debate as such is because that's the actual dichotomy that's being objected to by methodological individualist free will libertarian types. and the collectivist representation of the argument doesn't really make sense because the individualists are not suggesting that groups and social organization is not an inherent property of nature. It's, of course it's going to happen when there's more than one person. It's just a difference in interpretation for how these structures form.
All right, now let's continue.
I find it very interesting that we can properly represent their position, but sort of like all the other flawed belief systems, they can't represent ours properly.
All right. Anyways, we're continuing.
Sure, all reason. You probably also think of classic communist states like the Soviet Union or China, but I'm willing to bet that you don't think of capitalism. Unless
Anything to say?
Oh, I was just going to. I don't know. I guess we could let him explain what he's talking about a bit more.
Sure.
that is, you've read my very persuasive essay in Current Affairs.
This is what I was talking about in terms of his insufferable smugness. It says, it's a very persuasive essay in my recent publication, Current Affairs.
There's nothing more frustrating than listening to someone who just very clearly has no idea what the fuck they're talking about, and it's gonna get worse throughout the video. They have no idea what they're talking about, yet they talk down their nose to everybody else in the discussion as though they're some sort of Ubermensch. It's very frustrating to listen to these people, and that's.
I mean, it's funny.
Sorry,
it's funny because I actually did read the essay before starting the stream, like an hour and a half ago or something, and I'm going to bring it up as it becomes relevant. I think I said this at the beginning of the stream, actually, but I'm curious if he makes the same points or if he goes in a completely different direction.
The video is just a summary of the point he attempts to make in the essay, and needless to say, it's not very good.
Collectivist. Capitalism, after all, is individualist, right? Which is the opposite of collectivist. Well, that's wrong. When you think of collectivism, you should also think of capitalism, and here's why. At its most basic, collectivist means a situation in which the individual subsumes his or her will to that of the group. Everyone must sacrifice their own personal well-being or willpower or agency or whatever to the well-being of the group.
So, and that's essentially right here. That's the entire premise of the essay. The political economy as it exists right now, how organizations maintain themselves in modernity, and how the state interacts with them. That is exactly the same thing as a free market, and therefore free marketers. He makes no distinction between advocates for the current political economy and people who are actual critics of political economies, like the Austrians, are just the same thing. It's the most vulgar Marxist look at the situation that one could possibly imagine.
And this is largely the reason why, well, I decided to put capitalism in quotation marks, because we know for an absolute certainty that people who use the term capitalism always assume that people or other people who are going to read that are going to have the same exact definition of capitalism as them, even though a Marxist might see that and think like, oh, capitalism means private ownership of the means of production for profit, whereas some libertarian party arc might see that and think, oh, capitalism means free market. And of course you have these two completely conflicting, mutually exclusive definitions with no way of being able to differentiate between the two. As such, the only way to accurately define capitalism in such a way to satisfy both is to, as Roderick Long described it, have or just define capitalism as a free market, free of government intervention, like what we have in the United States today. even though I think any honest economic observer would be able to see that we most certainly don't have a free market today. I think the existence of central banking should be enough evidence for that, but we could go into more if more evidence was desired. Suffice to say, it's nearly infinite. But that said, what you end up really seeing here is that this is kind of an obfuscation tactic you'll usually see from Marxists of all varieties, where they just throw out the term capitalism without really defining what that means, without explaining themselves, and you're kind of just left to interpret it on your own. He's probably trying to appeal to his own audience who have an identical definition to capitalism that he has, but it really comes off as shooting himself in the foot in terms of his ability to persuade, to convince, or otherwise market his opinions to others. It really limits other people's ability to understand what the hell he's talking about, and I can't help but think that's by design.
Oh, and that just sort of goes back to what we were saying earlier. You know, the inherent premise of this essay is just, well, collectivism is sacrificing your will to somebody else or the group or some political hierarchy. That's what markets and modernity are, and that's just the same thing as the absolutely the free market without any sort of intervention. But what I was actually going to say two things about this. For one, it's really funny when Marxists try and argue this position, because it shows what I've been saying for years, that Marxists have not actually read Marx's philosophy. If you read Capital Volume 1, Chapter 26, where Marx begins talking about primitive accumulation, Marx makes the very clear distinction between a basic market and what he refers to as the capitalist economy. And he makes note that the Land Enclosure Act of the early 19th century and things like that were actually required for what he calls capitalism to come into existence. So even in Marxist philosophy, if you were to follow, without really logically deconstructing it, Marx's interpretation of the market, you would not be able to argue the position that Marxists put forward today, that all markets are just capitalism.
Capitalism.
Yeah. So.
And also,
the other thing.
Well, just real quick, Grambo, I sent you the invite in DMs. You can send it to him. You can send it to Terry.
All right, but the other position that I was about to go in, the other thing that I was about to go into, is a lot of libertarians don't understand just exactly why I'm so concerned about associating the anarchist free association Rothbardian position with capitalism. And the reason particularly why I'm concerned, aside from the logical problem of explaining exactly what capitalism is to a neutral audience, or just the fact that it has inherent connotations to a political system which privileges capital over free association or other aspects of the market, and that doesn't seem like that's an accurate way of describing a free market. I don't know why you would give into that. The other reason is just because it associates the Austrian position with a bunch of other arguments for the political economy as it exists now, and I think that discounts how truly radical of a take on markets the Austrian position really is. The Austrian position argues fundamentally that it is a generally bad thing to have proprietors creating input independently of the consumers and producers. So essentially, that rules out, any political economy, whether or not it exists currently, existed in the past, or could exist in the future.
And Terry Davis is wondering when Antifa is going to cancel Marx for what he said about LaSalle.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Probably never, because that would require Marxists to completely change their label. And the fact of the matter is, like, it took decades for them to even cancel what's her name, founder of Plant Margaret Sanger.
They'll never go after Daddy Marx, even though he was a eugenicist, even though his research was financed by the Rothschild family.
I mean, that's probably why they'll never go after him, because that would unintentionally go after one of the most important pieces of propaganda that the Rothschilds need to maintain their monopoly over the global monetary system. Once he goes down, Marxism goes down. Once Marxism goes down, you basically have one half of most of the Hegelian dialectic models that are currently active in society today going down. So Marx still being up is very, very important to not only the central bankers but the state. So until we get rid of the state and central banking, he's not going to be given the infamy that he truly deserves. And yeah, Darky, he was a racist, absolutely.
Darky.
That's the name.
Those who can't see the chat, there's a person in our chat watching us named Darky. That's
yeah. Why isn't the chat on screen? It should be there. Is it? Yeah. Let me. We'll worry about that later. It's not, the chat's not loading, so yeah, we'll have to worry about that later. Anyways, let's keep watching the video.
The collective. The hand.
Whoa. Did you click something?
I did not.
Okay.
Just waiting on you.
All right.
The collective. They hand over their decision-making process to the group's decision-making process, or to the leader designated as representing the group. The definition of individualist, meanwhile, at its most basic means doing whatever the hell you want, whenever you want, without regard to the social group you may be a part of and whatever they want.
These are atomism.
Well, I mean, isn't this exactly what I was talking about earlier? With people who just strawman individualism and individualist ideas as atomism, just the belief that it's completely unethical for anyone to have any associations with anyone ever.
Surprise, that's not actually something that anyone actually believes.
Who would have thought?
Can we address this argumentum ad definitionum really quickly?
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
So, the way that, somebody who isn't a clown would talk about observations, or would talk about characterizing a particular belief system or something that they're observing, would not be to try and create an arbitrary descriptive concept to apply it, and then apply that to it. The way that somebody would actually argue this position would be to describe it the way that they are observing it, and sort of explain why exactly that is a justified way of conceiving of this particular subject. When you just cite the dictionary and then act as if this description of what something is a proper observation of reality and nature, what you're doing is you're stultifying any possibility of discussion about whether or not that's a valid interpretation, because it's just essentially, it is a description. It is not actually based on anything tangible. It's saying that something is like this, and not actually justifying why that's the case. It's essentially like somebody I think Roderick Long spoke about this. Imagine if he were to just make up a word, axlebacks. You could explain this.
Mm-hmm.
I've been talking enough.
And I just want to say I got chat working. Yay!
All right. Yeah,
Yeah.
we'll have the technical details worked out in future streams.
Yeah, as I said
But,
right now, like we didn't. This is kind of our test stream, so things are going to be working 100%. And the fact of the matter is, I should actually move that the video a little bit to the left. All right. So, anyways, you end up when you. I'm sorry. Where were we before? I kind of lost track.
We're talking about how you can't use definitions to explain the nature of something.
Ah, right. I mean, what's a definition going to do? It just tells you what something is. Doesn't it hardly gives you any context as to why it would be used, who's using it, what purpose does it serve to use a definition a certain way? And it also does nothing to. I think I said context already. But you end up with all sorts of situations where the same term can be used to describe certain things, or even a certain word can be used to describe a thing with contradictory properties. Roderick Long's axlebacks, for example, is a round metallic sphere like the Washington Monument. Naturally, the Washington Monument is not a metallic sphere, but because it has that definition, it falls into the Randian concept of, well, the anti-concept, which is that it's just a term that people use to give significance. Give me a second here. I need a brain. It's just a term that's used specifically to obfuscate conversation rather than to clarify. It works against the purpose. It works against the purpose of language, which is to provide understanding, convey information. It conveys, for lack of a better term, anti-information. It, as I said before, obfuscates. It prevents people from being able to understand things. And, well, you end up with situations like, well, collectivism versus individualism, or, as we were talking about earlier, capitalism.
I see this a lot with debates that I've had against Marxists that I've commented back and forth with them. For instance, if you're going to try and explain why property is a justified concept and why necessarily it has to be exclusive. They reply, well, socialism is when you can commonly own something, and you can, unless you deconstruct the idea that definitions can be used to describe properties, well, then you're constantly going to be running into positions built upon that pretext, which use it to justify incoherent ideas, like the notion that everyone can own a scarce resource.
All right. And should we keep going?
Yeah, sure.
All right.
Extreme situations, two poles on a big spectrum of collectivist to individualist. Most times there's a mix of both of these things happening. There's a push and a pull between the collective will and the individual will. There's a negotiation between the well-being of the group and the well-being of the individuals that constitute the group. It all depends on what kind of group you're in.
I'm sorry, but this is just gobbledygook. It's meaningless platitudes. There's a push and a pull between the individual will and the collective will. What? First off, the collectives don't have wills. They're just, at best, aggregates, and even then, like, they're a very abstract concept in general.
Yeah, we essentially already uprooted the entire basis of this video in just the first 2 points. But something interesting to note is that because he's created these two, this series of abstract, very general ideas, he's made it so it is essentially impossible to criticize his interpretation of how things are organized in society. For instance, he's talking about a negotiation between individuals and collectives. What is he describing? Mutual aid societies, corporations, governments. Unless you're going to try and argue that all of these organizations have the same interest, which is absolutely absurd, and that just it falls apart when you start actually questioning like what exactly is his basis for describing things the way that he does.
I don't think he has any basis whatsoever. I think he's just throwing out words. I'm still trying to wrap my head around this idea of a negotiation between individual will versus collective will. I guess the point he was trying to make is that you have a society today in which people are basically coerced into surrendering their rights to some larger organization, namely the state, and you also have at least a pretense of individual liberty and people who seek to maximize the will of the individual within that very same society, and as such, there's kind of this coexistence that's really more adversarial than anything, mostly because of the nature of the state and state rule. But yeah,
it's essentially a non-falsifiable argument, because no matter what way you try and contextualize this argument, because he doesn't provide any sort of tangible bounds for what he's explaining, he can always come back with, well, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about something completely unrelated. Arguments like this annoy me, and that's a big part of the reason why I tend to ignore videos like this.
Yeah, but it's low-hanging fruit, and honestly, it's kind of fun to just tear into these people of questionable intelligence, no matter how relaxing the piano music they use in their backgrounds. Anyways,
kind of mood you're in, the ideology of the country you inhabit, or the community you inhabit. The classic view of capitalism as individualist and communism as collectivist is at least as old as Marx. But the more recent hardline division between the two can be traced to Friedrich von Hayek, intellectual father of the neoliberal consensus.
Oh crap! I did a thing. Give me a second here. I misclicked.
Oh my god!
But
that is wrong on so many levels. I don't even know where to begin.
I mean, first off, I want to get into this because I haven't actually written down anything yet, but I am looking to do a video about neoliberalism, and it's one of those canards that's particularly prominent among Marxists to try to ascribe some theory to people whose ideology and whose actual philosophies they don't actually understand. So they just apply this label that no serious person actually believes or actually identifies with. If I recall correctly, didn't Hayek identify as a social democrat?
Yes, he did.
Yeah. And to say that he's a neoliberal, it's just like, I understand, I'm trying to understand neoliberalism, but here's the thing. Neoliberalism doesn't actually exist. There are no neoliberals. Now, of course, on the internet, you may be able to find people here and there who self-identify unironically as neoliberals, but in actuality, what is a neoliberal? It's supposedly people who believe that the government should be limited in its ability to intervene socially and economically, like the people we have in the United States today. This is a third example of exactly what me and Esso have been talking about this entire stream. This whole thing about Zaxelbaxes, these anti-concepts with completely mutually exclusive and totally contradictory definitions. Like, they say that neoliberalism has been in power since the Reagan administration in 1980, at least in the United States and throughout the West. In the meantime, Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush again, Obama, Donald Trump, they're all supposedly neoliberals, and yet not a single one has done anything that can even be closely resemble, that can even remotely resemble as reducing the extent to which the government intervenes in the U.S. economy, and both economically and socially. So I don't understand what the hell they're talking about. Well, I do understand what they're talking about, but it just serves to emphasize the point I'm trying to make, that neoliberalism does not actually exist. People aren't neoliberals. They're just throwing that label out specifically because they don't know how they think. And of course, it circles back to where we were talking about Marxists earlier in the stream. That because they don't debate, they don't communicate, they don't have dialogues, they don't research, they don't do anything else that they would otherwise, they don't do any other the things that would help them at least achieve something resembling an understanding of what their opponents actually think. If they did do research, they would probably be able to figure out like how the state works, state motives, and the motives of the actors that make up the state. They'd be able to figure out exactly what SEK3 was talking about in terms of the class conflict between rulers and the ruled. And they might actually be able to figure out some of that stuff. Maybe they might not agree with it, maybe because they're just ideologues, but at least they'd understand where people like us are coming from. But instead, they just throw out, neoliberal! Neoliberal! He's a neoliberal!
I'm going to go ahead and assume that that's because he is a state propagandist, working for current affairs. But, I mean, he goes on in the video specifically to try and equate Hayek's views to Margaret Thatcher. So he's not explicitly stating it because he knows, that would on its face be absurd. Like, even a lot of Marxists would be like, hey, that's a step too far there. But he is essentially trying to insinuate that essentially anybody who's not a Marxist is a capitalist, and everybody who's a capitalist just thinks the same thing.
Apparently, because doesn't that fall into Marx's idea of class and class interests, that everyone who's either part of the bourgeois or the proletariat all think and act exactly the same way and have the same interests one way or another, and are only capable of acting according to those interests without even being able to explain anything that would even closely resemble, or that would even remotely resemble a praxeological argument?
Unless the exact same state is using its power against the so-called bourgeois class, then it's no longer capitalism.
All right. Well, I have another point to make, but I'll save it for a little later. Let's continue going.
I was going to elaborate on what I was, how absurd it is to try and say that Austrians would argue the same thing as, say, monetarists or neoclassicals or Keynesians. I've even heard Keynesians described as neoliberals. That just makes, there's no reason to take anybody who would say something like this seriously. It is either willful ignorance or it is an admission that you don't know what you're talking about. Austrians, for instance, like you mentioned this earlier, they would say neoliberalism has been in power for the last 50 years. So that would suggest economic policy advisors like Milton Friedman are, neoliberals. People who believe that, or at least would have argued publicly, that you need to prescribe interest rates through central banking, or people who would have agreed that WTO policies or World Bank financial intervention, enforced through the UN, would be something that is desirable, when no Austrian would argue that position, because Austrians would see those as fundamental distortions of human action. Like it's creating the impression that resources exist which don't actually exist, or it's limiting the ability for people to pursue their most highly valued preference. And no, Hayek never argued for any of those things. So he, I'm going to go ahead and assume that he's a propagandist
Well,
and knows full well that that is not something this is a disingenuous characterization of Hayek's views. If not, though, then as mentioned earlier, he has no credibility by anyone who actually gives a shit at this point.
It's a fun, clever trick to be able to label people with a definition or with an ideology that nobody actually believes in, at least nobody seriously believes in, because you can just attribute anything that they say or do to neoliberalism, and you can basically just work backwards from the conclusion that this benefits that what they're doing, anything the government ever does ever can therefore be justified, or at the very least explained as this benefits the bourgeois in some way. It somehow does. I just know it does. And it's as I said before, it's very useful for preventing people from being able to think. This is what anti-concepts are supposed to do.
It's especially absurd to try and ascribe this to Hayek, because Hayek, he introduced to the Austrian methodology a pretty controversial idea, which is that market actors themselves can have sort of internally a version of the calculation problem. This is something that like Roderick Long and Kevin Carson have expanded upon quite a bit, but that if an organization were to scale up, because state subsidies and all these sort of legal privileges allow them to externalize costs onto their unconsenting neighbors, if they were to scale upwards beyond the point that in a market they would be able to actually maintain their assets, there's a point that they can scale up to where they would start having internal problems with management, like information would start traveling less efficiently, or they would start not being able to communicate internally because people are doing things that are associated with being written up or being penalized within the model of organization by the management, and that's important for the organization to calculate in a profit loss scenario, but they can't do that because that's not being conveyed. I personally, back when I used to be a wage slave at Walmart, I have personally seen this firsthand. People knocking things off the shelves and not reporting it because they know that if they did, they would get fired or they would get written up.
Mm-hmm. Now, anyways, I'm going to keep playing.
In his book, The Road to Serfdom, which is a terrible book, Robert, he tried to suggest that the New Deal welfare programs and the British welfare state were collectivist. He argued that these very mild social programs would put the world, the Anglophone world at least, on the road to serfdom.
Yeah, we got to talk about this for a second.
You got to talk about... I'm sorry, where do we begin?
Well, this is something that you'll see in essentially all authoritarian arguments, but I haven't really seen anybody call it out, and I was planning on actually doing an essay about it. I was going to call the essay State and the Poisoned Well, but yeah, what you'll notice is that most arguments for the state actually intervening assume that whatever conclusion the person is trying to argue for, what they think the conclusion of the state getting involved in their subjects' affairs would be, is true in the framing and premise of their argument. Mm-hmm. And this is a great example of that.
Yeah.
Oh,
and
how absurd is it that these basic safety nets are being equated with feudal serfdom?
Oh, it It's just a very mild program. You remember the Civilian Conservation Corps, where people were enslaved into public works projects, regimented into military-style organization, and basically made to dig ditches and then fill them up again? Oh, that was just a mild program. Never mind the fact that it was literally modeled after what was going on in Nazi Germany. Also, what was it? The National Recovery Act. Oh, that was just a very mild, complete dominion over all production and requiring all members to quote-unquote voluntarily sign up to their price controls, their wage controls, their production quotas. Oh, that was just a very mild program. You have a problem with mild programs, huh, peasant?
Remember FDR's original proposal to put Jews in America in concentration camps in order to try and appease Nazi Germany? That was just a mild relocation program.
Oh, of course. I mean, everyone knows that FDR was not a radical or anything like that. I mean, he didn't find a lot of ideas put forward by fascist Italy or Nazi Germany to be very favorable during World War II. I mean, or during the Great Depression, sorry. He wasn't very complimentary of that quote-unquote Italian gentleman.
He definitely was not inspired by something that rhymes with Yahtzeism.
And he definitely does not have a very disturbing family history and may or may not have married his cousin. Yeah.
But, yeah, so just what I was going to say, like that, what you added on to the fact that, you know, this is literal slavery, and that, you know, the ethical problems with this. I'm not even getting into that. The way that this position is framed sort of makes that impossible. It also carries a sort of implicit moral indignation, and also is built upon a series of different assumptions that are not proven by the person attempting to make the argument. It's essentially just, it's lazy. A lazy way for them to try and justify their position in public discourse by finger waving and pearl clutching at whoever is arguing something that they don't like. And a great example which would illustrate the problems with this is you could very easily, you know, make this argument against their position. And initially, until like the early 20th century, this idea that the welfare state, that antitrust laws, that licensing or just state intervention is something that's actually aimed to break up these big state finance corporate monopolies. That's actually a relatively recent revision. In reality, up until the early 20th century, it was widely, you know, known and even argued by states that these programs are specifically intended to make it so people can't own the products of their own associations, make it so they're more dependent on central organizations which are dictated and organized by the state, make it so they're more dependent on the state's political financial system, make it so supply chains are controlled more heavily by the state itself, etc. In fact, welfare programs, as I've argued in streams with 2 cents, you could very easily, as many people have convincingly made the case that welfare subsidies represent a redistribution to corporations. Mm-hmm. Because it makes it so the labor market is, you know, it's less capital intensive, but at the same time it makes it so these people are more dependent on state financial programs that would require them to work for organizations like Walmart, or, you know, just as an example, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, the basic idea. Yeah. Sorry, but the basic idea is that the price of living has necessarily gone up as a result of artificial scarcity. However, because of welfare programs, poor people have been able to eat that cost a lot more easily, whereas in their absence, people would generally demand greater wages, which would put greater pressure on businesses. So in a very indirect way, welfare to poor people is very much a welfare to corporate America. This in addition to all the other direct examples of corporate welfare: favorable tax rules, direct subsidies, direct payments, contracts with the government directly, for example, barriers to entry, zoning laws, all those shenanigans that just, well, I'm pretty sure this guy doesn't really have much of a problem with.
In fact, prior to the examples he goes on to give are that in the absence of state intervention, everyone would just not have access to health care. They'd have to pay for it, and they of course couldn't pay for it because that's whatever moral argument against that. Or people would have nothing to fall back on if they lost their jobs. Well, prior to a lot of these welfare programs and licensing laws, most people in the United States were not only self-employed, but there were organizations referred to at more commonly as fraternal societies that were essentially mutual aid organizations that provided free healthcare to the members who joined them. So essentially, the market created universal healthcare, and the state killed it.
Pretty much. Now let's keep going because
it's weird that if you actually look up fraternal societies, you'll find. I'm sorry to interrupt, but yeah, you'll find that 90% of the U.S. population were members of a fraternal society. So it's weird that they were such a large part of everyday living in the 19th century, yet you never hear about them. It would be like if in 100 years from now nobody knew what the NHS was. If you think that there is not an agenda behind why you don't know about that, you are sorely mistaken.
Oh, and by the way, Philosophossum, Bitbutter's video is actually just Roderick Long's essay about that very topic, just animated. And don't get me wrong, like his animation and the video itself is absolutely phenomenal. But just a quick reference. But anyways, yeah, let's keep going because I'm pretty sure it gets worse.
I was gonna say one last thing. So current affairs. Why is it that you don't want poor people to have a basic safety net? On current affairs, why are you being so exploitative of the poors?
Why do you hate poor people? Why do you want them to continue being poor?
Road to serfdom. He even compared these basic social safety nets with Nazism and Soviet collectivism.
Well, that's because a lot of the New Deal programs were directly lifted from Nazi Germany. I'm pretty sure there were a few lifted from the Soviet Union, but I don't have that information off the top of my head. But I wouldn't be surprised.
You'll note that he doesn't actually quote what Hayek actually said.
Mm-hmm. And I'm pretty sure if he did, it would basically make him look like an idiot.
The only thing, he argued, that could save people from the dreaded free healthcare of the British National Health Service, or the nightmarish benefits of Social Security, horrors like the elderly not dying in poverty, was a harsh social Darwinian.
Yeah, see what I'm talking about?
Of course,
I have to go back a second because we cut him off when he was saying something particularly hilarious.
Was a harsh social Darwinian liberal capitalism.
Really? Really? The progressive is going to start talking to us about social Darwinism.
That's
asking.
This guy is just the most phenomenal smug asshole I have ever seen, and yeah, I don't want to say anything further because I wouldn't feel comfortable describing what would happen if he were within arm's reach of me, if he started talking like this to me.
Instead we could start talking about the way that he's attempting to characterize these programs, because we've covered some of the lovely things that the NHS has started doing.
Like
So,
incinerating babies to heat the damn hospital.
or refusing to feed or provide medicine to old people to kill them off. Just if somebody goes into the hospital, killing them and harvesting their organs because they're in need of organs. They're just, if they have a shortage, they just decide, oh, this fucker deserves to die. Let's go ahead and put him under without his consent.
Or
So,
how about the break? Or how
yeah,
about
if you go to a hospital, if a doctor working at an NHS hospital just decides that you are going to die, they can kill you, and there is nothing legally you would be able to do about it.
And the best part is, like, the NHS is the national religion of the United Kingdom, so naturally they're never going to want to touch that or do anything about it. It is quite honestly a sacred cow. Now, Social Security is another very interesting topic because, as JC Armitage says in the chat, not only is it a Ponzi scheme, this is absolutely true, but there's also the extent to which, and I think I've heard this argument before, and I think it's a good one, about how it breaks down the intergenerational relationship between elderly people and younger people. The way it's supposed to work, or at least it did previously, was that people usually saved for retirement. People still do this, by the way, but when you have this perception of just getting free money from the government in your elderly days, that's going to naturally put a depressing nature, or going to put depression, or it's going to depress the number of people that are going to be taking those very necessary steps. And of course, as part of that saving for retirement process involves raising a family, making sure that you have productive kids and productive grandkids who will otherwise be able to help you at your old age. It's basically a way to incentivize people to raise their kids better, make sure they're productive with good skills so that they can help them in the future. You're putting a down payment on your retirement, for lack of a better term. And instead, they're just deciding to replace in the same way that they've replaced young people's and kids' parents with the state. They're replacing the kids and the grandkids of the elderly with the state as well. So this is another example of the state usurping the role of family in a way that I quite honestly think is one of the most reprehensible things that the state does. I don't know if I don't know what you think about that.
No, I think that the state's sort of parasite order, because that's something people like this guy would argue, that the state creates social order, but as many people, such as Sam Conkin, have convincingly argued, it's not actually possible to follow legislation consistently, because legislation would, if that were to be done, it would totally stultify anyone's ability to act. So obviously social orders exist independently from the so-called legal order. Therefore, it would be more accurate to characterize the legal order that states impose onto societies as a sort of parasitic social order where people act within it who are in elite positions of political influence or authority over society, and that position is held up by the backs of people who aren't affiliated, or people in jail who are on sort of the low end of the system, so to speak.
I mean, I disagree with that, but only the extent to which you called it a social order. I've said before in other videos, and I think I'm going to repeat it here, that the state is social chaos, where you have all sorts of, you have anything that resembles social order, rules, norms that are just made to be completely arbitrary and dependent on the whim of not only legislators but the agents that are tasked with enforcing the will of the legislators. It's completely random.
That's what legislation is. If it's enforced by the state, it's a series of things that the state will threaten you with if you try to, if those are behaviors you try and engage in, or they will attempt to financially disincentivize that behavior by obtaining control over a large degree of your ability to act in society or your assets directly. They'll create financial legislation which incentivizes banks to seize property or makes it so organizations can create property divisions that are just unilaterally declared and they can't actually demonstrate that they own part of that land.
Mm-hmm. Now let's continue.
Sure.
For Hayek,
What?
the collectivism's specter was a tool for scaring people away from caring about the common good. This tactic.
Hayek was a sockdem.
He was very concerned about the collective good. Fact of the matter is, it's in the interest of the collective good that he was so critical about Nazism and so critical about collectivism in general. And I'm referring to specifically the collectivist authoritarian philosophies like communism and socialism. He recognized, and there were other socialists present in the era. For example, what's his name? George Orwell. He was a avowed socialist, but he did the most to describe in very visceral terms like just the horrors of collectivism, of authoritarian collectivism, and the implications that it would have on social relationships, on people's relationships with their erstwhile rulers. And these people are coming around just saying like, Animal Farm, that's just fiction. 1984, don't worry about that. I mean, he's not only trying to demonize Hayek by trying to make him out to be someone that he isn't. I'm pretty sure he would say the exact same thing about George Orwell. I mean, what was it? Nancy Pelosi who said that 1984 was a message about how we should obey our government.
It was Hillary Clinton who said that, but still.
All right.
What I was going to say is, Hayek would have probably agreed a lot more with his take on the state than he would with ours. That he would absolutely trash this tard's view of economics.
Oh my goodness, I would resurrect him just to have these two in a conversation with each other. It would be hilarious. He would this guy would just call Hayek a neoliberal, and he'd be like, "What?"
Yeah, I'd love to personally to see some of the older Austrians brought back, not to talk to people like this, but to talk some sense into the fucking Hoppians.
I mean, to be fair, nothing's going to ever talk sense into the Hoppians, and let's be honest, they'll try to resurrect Milton, or not, I'm sorry, what's his name? Rothbard. They'll try to resurrect him because at that point he will already have gone post-1985, and he'd basically just say things like, the state should be in total control of the society. I think that's a good thing, and that's how we achieve anarchism.
Sam Konkin versus Hoppe.
That would be
happen.
I can guarantee you that Hop would have absolutely no frickin' idea about anything that Konkin would ever say. It just wouldn't. It wouldn't even be a fair fight. Anyways,
have you ever read? I'm sorry. Have you just? Sorry to get off topic for a bit, but have you read Sam Konkin's debate with David Gordon, one of the people who registered the Libertarian Party?
No, I didn't.
It's on the subject of whether or not libertarianism can be political, and David, I don't know if you've read it, but if you could find a transcript of the debate, I think a video of it exists, but it's not uploaded anywhere. If someone would upload it, that would be the most amazing. I'd pay somebody for it. But David Gordon got so salty after that debate that he had the Libertarian Party's publishing organization, Laissez-Faire Books, deplatform the magazine Konkin was publishing, New Libertarian Weekly.
And what was the guy's name? Was David Gordon?
Yeah, David Gordon. No, not Gordon. Oh, fuck. I'm blanking on his name, but the one that the diamond political compass is named after. You've seen that one?
I'm terrible with names, so I wouldn't remember.
Nolan.
What?
It's David Nolan. I meant. Sorry. Sorry to anybody who's watching. It's not David Gordon. It's David Nolan. David Gordon is somebody else who, you know, he's a paleolib and he has his own problems.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, I'll be sure to try to look for that after the stream. But anyways, yeah, let's continue.
Was essentially meant to prevent solidarity by pitting people against each other and giving.
I'm sorry. The whole point of individualist capitalism was to prevent solidarity and pit people against each other. I mean, if you from the Marxian perspective, I can see where you're coming from. However, it's a lot easier to attribute that to having a different understanding rather than, you know, pure malice.
I'm pretty sure that you know, considering that I am an Austrian, I may, you know, if I may say so, I'm pretty sure that the entire premise of how Austrians view economic interactions are that they should be viewed as sort of a social science, and that the reason they happen is because of people pursuing their own most highly valued preference. So quite literally, you cannot have an Austrian analysis which assumes that there are just aggregates antagonizing each other, because the entire premise of the Austrian methodology is that there are individuals, they inform their own interests of what they want, and they associate in pursuit of those interests, if we're assuming that there's no intervention, in pursuit of each other's mutual interests.
If I were to sum up what he just said, and this is only like a sentence fragment, but I think it's still interesting, it's basically, you oppose class consciousness? You must be evil! He's just trying to figure out the most smug way to present it, and in all honesty, when I was watching this before, I came to the conclusion that this guy's playing a character, and he's specifically trying to get video responses.
Well, I mean, I guess they succeeded.
Well, it worked. This is the kind of thing that people like to...
It's not a video response.
It's not a video
response.
Yeah, and
Sorry.
honestly, people really do enjoy taking down smug assholes. It's cathartic. Alright, continuing.
What I was going to say is it's actually kind of ironic to see Marxists, you know, throw it, because that actually is a pretty common accusation they will make, is you're just a bourgeois stooge trying to pit people against one another. Literally, the material dialectic is the notion that people just exist in homogeneous categories in society and inherently are antagonistic towards the interests of one another. Literally, that's what the Hegelian dialectic is. Mm-hmm. It's creating these arbitrary identity-based categories, trying to ascribe motivations and interests to them, and then trying to pit them against each other.
As you said in the Hop video, what is the bourgeois, not the proletariat? What are the proletariat, not the bourgeois? Now, anyways, let's continue.
In psychopathic people and corporations, the moral justification for continuing to be psychopaths. This idea was rooted in the belief that progress, good societies, only come out of ruthless competition between individuals.
Nobody actually believes that. That's, again, another one of these straw men. I think we've already talked about this, so let's just continue. Okay?
Yeah, I'm good with that.
An idea popularized in the 19th century by mutton chops over here. But
Herbert Spencer.
Oh my god, this myth needs to fucking die.
In the 19th century
Herbert
by mutton
Spencer.
chops.
Herbert Spencer was not a fucking social Darwinist. He argued explicitly against that position. Just argued that the state shouldn't be. That's.
Where did that even come from? That he's a social Darwinist.
I've seen Marxists trying to. It's just a case of quote mining. It's kind of like when they take that quote of Mises in the context of condemning political economies, saying that the political economy of Europe needed fascism to sustain itself through the Depression. Taking that and then omitting the paragraph where he uses this to then condemn concept of sort of top-down prescribed economic models, and uses that to try and claim that he was defending fascism. It's another case of quote mining, essentially.
Yeah, that's what I figure. Also, you gotta love how in the video they write down his name in pink Comic Sans, specifically to make it look as unappealing as possible.
Like, using Comic Sans, really? Do you want us to take you seriously or not?
Well, what they're trying to do is get us to like, people have a intrinsic dislike towards Comic Sans for reasons good or bad, but they want us to apply that onto this picture of Herbert Spencer himself. And so they specifically did that to make us dislike Herbert Spencer. It's a form of psychological manipulation, and now that I've explained how it works, it has no effect on our audience.
Herbert Spencer, but yeah, he called out the progressive movement because of its eugenic influences, and he was a critic of the political system in the state, and he criticized the Tory party especially on the grounds that they were promoting sort of Darwinian practices. If you were to just read his essay, The New Toryism, or really any of his works, you'll know that was the case. But also, Herbert Spencer was an early anarchist and influenced a lot of the anarchist thinkers, and was not particularly an influence on Hayek. So this literally just is ANCAP Keynesianism.
Beautiful. Anyways, continuing. Actually, before we continue, I just noticed a comment from Jude's. Hey, libertarians, do you guys agree there should be a societal structure to hold people to moral standards, but the government should not be a part of it?
Is that a serious question, or is that something gonna, be followed by that? I mean, is he there? Are they going to follow up with that?
Yes, actually. If society and the people aren't held to basic moral standards by other people, society will collapse.
Oh, so that is a serious question. Oh.
Where do we begin?
Well, first of all, there's the idea that we're assuming that people are unaccountable, so then unaccountable people need to make them accountable. The classic, circular reasoning inherent in statism that a lot of people have refuted in numerous ways. So if we're going to argue that the state exists to promote morality and that people don't have morality without the state, and that just sort of falls apart on its premise. But then there's also the notion that morality, it's both a relative concept, but also something that needs to be sort of imposed and regimented, which, that's a great example, actually, of how arguments for authority very nakedly conflict with lived reality about how people interact with society. Because obviously, even in state society, like most state societies right now, for instance, the government is the least popular institution in those societies. In the U.S. government, for instance, has like a 4% approval rating, I think, in even normie polls. So now I'm not suggesting that there's like that 90% of the population plus are anarchists, but the idea that states sort of create this uniform idea, this uniform social order, it sort of it obviously is not true. But
Here's the,
that conflicts with the statists' argument that you can vote to make the state accountable. He's got to vote harder.
and Jude's did follow up saying that he's not talking about the state, he's talking about the church. And one point I did want to bring up is, well, what are morals? Well, morals are how people apply ethics in their own lives, in their own existence, in their own daily existence. And ethics are, well, universal and objective. Now the question is, I guess the question you really want to ask is, how do you enforce ethics? And the question is, you don't. Ethics only really matter when you come into conflict with someone else, usually because they aggressed against you and you can demand restitution from them. Ethics are the methodology, or rather the means, by which you can justify your claim to restitution from someone who aggressed against you. Now, I should note that we've been going on for an hour and 30 minutes, so I say we actually start to wrap this up, but let's go hit one more little segment first, and then we'll end the stream. Sound good?
Sure, but could I add something onto that? Because I was under the impression that they were arguing about the state in general. No, that's a very common misconception that the assuming ethical truth claims are real inherently means that you're assuming everybody just has some sort of inherent morality they have to discover or have to apply to themselves in order for that to be realized. No, it's just that... Hold on a minute.
Alright, so, yeah, the basic idea is that people are going to...
Alright.
If you assume morality, then you're... Whether intentionally or unintentionally, I'm going to assume unintentionally, are going to enforce their own personal ideas as to how certain ethical truths ought to be maintained throughout society, to say nothing of the possibility of certain cultural norms being justified on the basis of morality or something like that.
Okay, well, just what I was going to say before I was interrupted by one of the people that I'm staying with currently, was just that there is no assumption that everyone in society is going to operate around some sort of internalized uniform morality. It's just that because these ethical standards exist, we need to ask how exactly what would be the best way to make it so everybody could actually apply these ethical standards to their own lives, and in society these standards are realized. And the best way to do that is for arbitration to be as decentralized as possible, because that makes arbiters accountable, and that makes it so everyone in that association has as much leverage over their own position as possible. For instance, they would be able to dispute not only the claim, but sort of the framework of the claim itself. For instance, somebody makes a property claim. Okay, well, that's fine, but what if their property claim is you looked at them the wrong way and they didn't like it? Well, you got to be able to say, well, that's not a property claim, so what exactly are we having this service for? That's something you couldn't do now. In fact, throughout most of history, there were things called sumptuary laws, where literally, if you looked at certain people the wrong way, you could be imprisoned by the state. But yeah, that is something that comes out through decentralized arbitration that you can't really get in a state society or with a prescribed system.
All right. So, anyways, last part. Like we're only 3 minutes in. This is a 10-minute video, but still, I think it's very illustrative, and we've talked about most of what we need to talk about already. But still, just for funsies' sake, let's do one last part, and let's see what this smug moron has to say.
Over here. But Hayek and Herbert Spencer, of course, weren't the only people thinking this way. Margaret Thatcher famously said, "There is no society. There are individual men and women, and there are families," which is how she sounded.
Yeah, I'm aware that Margaret Thatcher had a Westminster accent. Now, with this in mind, like, this is something I wanted to say earlier when Margaret Thatcher was brought up, but I wanted to save it for now, or I wanted to save it for this part. Wasn't Margaret Thatcher a huge protectionist?
Yeah,
like
a huge protectionist.
Wasn't like her this belief that England should be self-sufficient or the UK should be mostly self-sufficient the main driving force behind the UK going into a massive recession?
Yeah, and the only reason that morons try to equate her position with people like Friedman or Hayek, because her position's beyond even what like monetarists would argue. But the only reason why is because legally she Margaret Thatcher's administration started making certain areas which were previously nationalized privatized. Like the railway would be a pretty famous example. Now, if your only frame of reference is just private equals capitalism and capitalism equals free market, that equals bad, well then you could maybe equate that position with something Hayek would have argued, but of course that's not the case. In what Margaret Thatcher actually did, privatization just meant contracting these services to organizations which were fronts for the government.
Basically, what happened is that, and this is the thing that always happens with privatization, they give a single organization, a business, a monopoly over a certain thing, and then they're surprised when suddenly the prices get jacked up because of the government enforced monopoly. Weird.
Yeah, it's really strange how Marxists, one of the main points they emphasize is the understanding of private ownership as a political concept, something legislated. Yet, they don't seem to apply that to that when they're making criticisms of the capitalist system.
Oh, naturally.
An organization can be considered legally private, yet be 100% funded by the government and run by government agents. So, I mean, in a sense, that's not inaccurate, but at the same time, you should stop trying to claim then that is what we're arguing when we talk about property ethics.
Yeah. Well, anyways, I think that's all we have for tonight, unless we have anything else to add.
Well, I was perfectly willing to go on for another hour, and that's the reason why I was talking so much. I guess we got to prepare. We can get away with it since this is sort of the pilot stream, but we should prepare to stream for 3, maybe 4 hours later.
Possibly. It's just that I could go on further, but the main problem is I noticed our viewers were starting to drop off. So I wanted to keep the streams, a little snappy.
Fair enough, I guess. That's all that I really had to say. Later on in the video, the current affairs guy Mr. Dunning-Kruger Marxist here, attempts to essentially, explain that the capitalist system is the political economy that we have now, which of course is not actually a free market. It's so mired in political intervention that that's actually kind of a laughable thing to argue at this point.
I don't even understand like how they can look themselves in the mirror and realize some of the things that they say. Do they? I just wonder. I seriously wonder what's the difference between willful dishonesty and being honestly mistaken. I understand that to a certain extent, ideology causes you to put on blinders that makes you otherwise immune to information that could be remotely contrary. And I'm sure you're also familiar with studies being done that people who hold certain convictions, whether they be political, religious, or otherwise, when they're exposed to contrary information, even if it's factual, will trigger the same response in the brain as physical attack. So naturally, they're going to want to defend themselves against it and come up with a whatever justification just to be able to say that whoever it is that's saying those things is wrong. But
it's because, as I've argued, people are taught to think of parties and legislation as something that's inherently tied to their own interests. Therefore, that if a certain a legislative act is proposed by another party that would antagonize that interest, then they're taught to think of that as something that goes against their interests. You'll literally see people who are stuck in party politics saying, "Well, I don't think that I should associate with people who want me dead." So, I mean, that's how they actually see it, and that's pretty scary, but it's very, if you think about it from the state's perspective, it's very valuable to promote that mentality, because that essentially creates a dependence of people on the political system, so that they'll never actually try to liberate themselves and never seek to undermine the state.
I think I understand where they're coming from a certain point of view. Whether they know it or not, I imagine it's unconscious. They realize that the state is, in one word, violence. It's just that violence that they perceive that they can use against other people in order to make their interests met. So they see themselves as part of either, in the United States, Team Donkey or Team Elephant. And they're all playing a game of sports ball to figure out who it is that gets to use the gun against the other. And whoever happens to win gets to use the gun. That's at least the perception. The actual reality is that it's a flip of the coin, where the results are heads they win, tails you lose. They being, of course, the state. But that's just how people believe. And if they think that at some point the force and violence of the state, when it's used against them, is going to be a direct threat to their lives and their livelihood, especially if they had ideas of, say, resisting or even being a victim of an arbitrary legislation where they're not even aware of. So for the most part, I think the observation that my life is literally in danger because of the opposing team, I get where they're coming from.
This is exactly why I think, it's sort of still seen as a bit of a hot take. It's understandable why this view is starting to take off, but I think that it's very important libertarians start to propose their view from the perspective of sort of a class dialectic between people who aren't associated with the state and state actors. Because very obviously the state is a coherent organization with its own interests, and its interests are built upon, coercing us and stealing our revenue and forcing us into associating in ways that otherwise would not be beneficial for us, or we wouldn't see to be our most highly valued preference. And when so aside from just being the better way of seeing the state, it just completely destroys this party idea, the idea that party politics is a way of actually achieving change. Also, that I mean, it is a threat to you. It's not how you meet your interests. You can very easily, like I'm doing and like Heretic does, associate around it and try to undermine the state's influence over your own life.
Hmm. Oh yeah,
But
definitely. Now with that,
very last,
yeah, sorry, just wrap it up.
I was trying to wrap up sort of the rest of what he was going to say in the video. The other thing of note that really caught my attention when I was watching it earlier was his description of modernity as a sort of neo-feudal legal structure where people are subjugated to the whims of corporations. Of course, from his perspective, that's a product of the market or whatever. But in reality, as Heretic and I and many other people have effectively argued, I would argue effectively anyway, corporations and banks and all these these white market institutions are actually constructs of the state. They're dependent upon the state in order to operate the way that they do, and organizations defining themselves as corporations is based on corporate law, which is based on joint stock law, was a product of the feudal legal code. So it would not be inaccurate if you were to make that case. The political economy created the shape of the white market, the legal market, and the legal market is a sort of neo-feudal order where only politically connected people are able to actually hold some leverage over themselves, but ultimately are still under the gun of the state. If that was his case, that would be a somewhat decent take, but of course it's not.
No, his argument, his observation that people have their wills assumed under a lot of large hierarchical organizations that we see in today's society, like corporations, like the state, like other things I can't really think of off the top of my head, that is a pretty accurate observation, but the conclusion he derives from that, therefore we need more government, or therefore it's free market's fault, is just simply wide off the. You're not even close to the target at that point. If you really were serious about solving these problems and you do identify as a problem, good for you. But I mean, if that's the case, then you must agree with us that the subsidies that the government gets in terms of zoning regulations, in terms of direct payments, in terms of favorable tax loopholes, in terms of liability, in terms of all of these other things, that I don't think we would have any real contention. But yeah, unfortunately, his solution is going to be just more of the same. We just need more government. The government caused the problems, therefore we need more of it. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. But anyways, yeah, let's get going. Alright, so thank you everyone for stopping by, and we'll be sure to be hosting more of these streams. Thank you. Bye.